Montana Highway 287, December 2018. The blizzard had been building for 3 hours, transforming a routine December ride into a life-threatening situation that caught 4 veterans completely unprepared. They'd been heading south from Great Falls toward Helena, a route they'd ridden dozens of times, when the weather forecast's light snow became whiteout conditions, with wind gusts hitting 60 miles per hour and temperatures dropping to 12 below zero. When Jake Morrison's front tire hit black ice and nearly sent him into a roadside ditch, the group made the decision to find shelter immediately rather than risk the remaining 40 miles to Helena. The farmhouse appeared through the snow like a mirage, a single lit window glowing amber in the darkness. What happened when 4 bearded bikers in leather knocked on Eleanor Crawford's door would challenge everything she'd believed for 70 years, force her to choose between fear and compassion, and ultimately reveal that the most dangerous prejudices are the ones we inherit without questioning. If you value stories about people confronting their own biases and choosing differently, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts of transformation when it mattered most. Eleanor Crawford had lived alone in the Montana farmhouse for 6 years, ever since her husband Robert died of a heart attack while fixing fence posts in the North Pasture. She was 73 years old, a retired schoolteacher who'd spent 42 years teaching 3rd grade in Helena before retiring to the farm Robert had inherited from his parents. The house sat on 160 acres of land that Eleanor no longer actively farmed, instead leasing it to neighboring ranchers who planted wheat and ran cattle. The isolation suited her. She had her routines: morning coffee watching sunrise over the Rockies, afternoon reading in the chair by the fireplace Robert had built, evening phone calls with her daughter Sarah, who lived in Billings with Eleanor's 3 grandchildren. She drove to Helena twice a week for groceries and church, saw her doctor monthly for the medications that managed her high blood pressure and arthritis, and otherwise kept to herself in the comfortable solitude of widowhood. What Eleanor didn't talk about, even with Sarah, was the fear she carried about certain kinds of people. She'd been raised in rural Montana in the 1940s and 50s by parents who taught her that bikers were dangerous, that men with tattoos and leather vests were criminals who hurt decent people. She'd internalized these lessons so thoroughly that she'd never questioned them, had simply arranged her life to avoid encounters with the kinds of people her parents had taught her to fear. The few times she'd seen motorcycle groups pass through Helena, Eleanor had crossed the street or returned to her car, her heart racing with anxiety she couldn't quite name or justify. When her grandson Tommy had mentioned wanting a motorcycle for his 16th birthday, Eleanor had been quietly horrified and had spoken privately to Sarah about the dangers of those kinds of people and that lifestyle. Sarah had gently pushed back, noting that millions of people rode motorcycles safely and that stereotypes about bikers were outdated, but Eleanor had held firm in her beliefs. Now at 7:30 p.m. on a December evening with a blizzard raging outside, Eleanor heard the sound she'd privately dreaded for years: motorcycle engines in her driveway. She moved to the window and saw 4 bikes pulling up to her porch, their riders dismounted and clearly in distress. Even through the snow she could see the leather vests, the beards, the appearance that matched every warning her parents had given her 70 years earlier. Her first instinct was to turn off the lights and pretend she wasn't home. Let them move on to find shelter elsewhere. These were the kinds of people who hurt women like her, who broke into homes and stole, and worse. Every movie she'd ever seen about motorcycle gangs reinforced this belief. Every news story about biker violence, every warning from her childhood. But as she watched through the window, she saw one of the men stumble and nearly fall, clearly suffering from cold exposure. She saw another helping him stay upright, supporting his weight while trying to guide him toward the porch, and she heard the knock on her door, urgent but not aggressive, the sound of people in genuine need. Eleanor's hand trembled as she approached the door. Every instinct told her not to open it, to call 911 instead and let authorities handle this situation. But 911 would take 45 minutes minimum to respond in this weather, and the men outside might not have 45 minutes if they were already showing signs of hypothermia. She opened the door 6 inches, keeping the chain lock engaged, and looked out at 4 of the most intimidating men she'd ever seen up close. They were massive, bearded, covered in snow and ice, wearing leather vests over winter gear. The one in front, a man with a grey beard and kind eyes that didn't match Eleanor's expectations, spoke first. "Ma'am, I'm Jake Morrison. We're veterans riding from Great Falls to Helena and got caught in the blizzard. We can't go any further in this weather. My friend here is showing signs of hypothermia. Can we please stay in your barn or garage tonight? We won't bother you. We just need to get out of the wind." Eleanor's mind was racing. Veterans. That detail didn't fit her stereotype. Neither did the polite request to stay in the barn rather than demanding entry to her house. Neither did the obvious concern these men showed for their hypothermic friend. "How do I know you're really veterans?" she heard herself ask, her voice shaking. "How do I know you're not going to hurt me?" Jake slowly reached into his jacket, moving deliberately so as not to startle her, and pulled out a military ID card. He held it up to the gap in the door where Eleanor could see it. "Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison, United States Army, retired, served 2 tours in Iraq. The other guys are Army and Marines. We're just trying to get home for Christmas, Ma'am. We're not going to hurt you." Eleanor studied the ID, then looked past Jake at the 3 other men. The one who appeared hypothermic was being supported by 2 others, his skin pale and his movements uncoordinated. If she turned them away and he died, she'd have to live with that. If she let them in and they hurt her, well, she'd been afraid of that her entire life, and maybe it was time to face whether that fear was justified. She made a decision that went against every warning she'd ever been given. "The barn isn't heated. You'll freeze to death out there. Come inside. But I'm calling my daughter to let her know you're here, and if anything happens to me, the entire county will know who you are." Jake nodded, understanding and accepting the terms. "Thank you, Mom. I promise you won't regret this." Eleanor released the chain lock and opened the door, stepping back as the 4 men entered her home, bringing cold air and snow and the smell of leather and exhaust. She immediately walked to her phone and called Sarah, her hands still shaking. "Mom, is everything okay?" "Sarah, I have 4 bikers in the house. They got caught in the blizzard and one of them is hypothermic. I'm going to help them, but I want you to know they're here. Their leader's name is Jake Morrison, says he's Army veteran. If I don't call you back in an hour, call the sheriff." There was a pause while Sarah processed this information. "Mom, do you feel unsafe? Do you want me to call the sheriff now?" "I don't know yet, but I couldn't let them freeze to death outside." "I'll call you in an hour." Eleanor hung up and turned to face the 4 men who were standing awkwardly in her entryway, dripping melting snow on her floor. Up close, they were even more intimidating than through the window. The smallest of them was easily 6 feet tall. Their vests had patches she didn't recognize, symbols and words that meant nothing to her but felt vaguely threatening anyway. "The hypothermic one needs to get warm immediately," Eleanor said, falling back on the practical first aid she'd learned in her teaching years. "Bathroom is down the hall, 2nd door. He needs to get out of wet clothes and into a warm shower, but not too hot or it'll shock his system. One of you help him." Jake nodded to one of the others, a Latino man with a scarred face who immediately began helping the hypothermic man down the hallway. Eleanor heard the bathroom door close and the shower start running. "The rest of you, take off your wet gear and hang it by the fire to dry. I'll make coffee and soup, and you're going to tell me exactly who you are and what you're doing out in a blizzard." Over the next hour, while Eleanor prepared food and monitored the hypothermic man's recovery, Jake Morrison told their story. They were members of the Iron Warriors MC, a veterans motorcycle club out of Great Falls. All four had served in Iraq or Afghanistan. They rode together to maintain the brotherhood they'd found in service, to support each other through PTSD and readjustment to civilian life, and to participate in charity work for veteran causes. They'd been returning from delivering Christmas presents to a VA hospital in Great Falls, toys and games they'd collected through fundraising. The weather forecast had called for light snow starting around 8 p.m. They'd planned to be in Helena by 6 p.m., well ahead of any weather. But the blizzard had arrived 2 hours early and intensified faster than predicted, catching them on an exposed stretch of highway with no good options. "We tried to push through," Jake explained, warming his hands on a coffee mug Eleanor had given him. But when Danny here started showing confusion and slurred speech, we knew we had to stop. Hypothermia kills fast. Your house was the first building we'd seen in 20 miles with lights on." Eleanor listened to this story while watching the men interact with each other. They were gentle with Danny, the hypothermic one, checking on him frequently and helping him into dry clothes Eleanor had found that had belonged to Robert. They were respectful to her, thanking her repeatedly and apologizing for the intrusion. They cleaned up after themselves without being asked, hanging their wet gear neatly and mopping the melted snow from her floor. Nothing about their behavior matched what she'd been taught to expect from bikers. They weren't aggressive or threatening. They didn't make her feel unsafe. They were just four middle-aged men who'd gotten caught in bad weather and were grateful for shelter. "Mom, can I ask you something?" This came from Marcus, the Latino man who'd helped Danny. "You seemed real scared when you opened the door. Was that because of how we look?" Eleanor felt her face flush with embarrassment and shame. "Yes, I was raised to believe that bikers were dangerous, that men who looked like you were criminals. I'm ashamed to admit it, but that's what I was taught." Marcus nodded, his expression understanding rather than angry. "A lot of people think that the outlaw clubs, the 1%ers who actually are criminals, they shaped how everyone sees us. But most clubs are just regular people who like to ride. We're teachers, construction workers, mechanics. I'm a nurse at the VA hospital. Jake here runs a hardware store. Tommy's a high school football coach. Danny's a social worker." "I didn't know that," Eleanor said quietly. "I never asked. I just believed what I was told." "Well, now you know," Marcus said with a slight smile. "We're just people, Mom. Some good, some bad, like any group. But most of us are just trying to live our lives and take care of each other." The conversation continued through the evening as the blizzard raged outside. Eleanor learned that Jake was a widower, whose wife had died of cancer 3 years earlier, that Marcus had 3 kids in college, that Tommy coached a championship football team while managing PTSD from his service, that Danny worked with homeless veterans, trying to get them housing and treatment. She learned that the Iron Warriors MC had raised over $50,000 in the past year for veteran causes, that they visited VA hospitals monthly, that they'd helped build a tiny home village for homeless vets in Great Falls. These weren't criminals. They were people doing meaningful work in their community, people who'd served their country and continued serving it in civilian life. Around 10 p.m., Eleanor called Sarah back as promised. "Mom, are you okay? Do you need me to call someone?" "I'm fine, honey. These men are veterans who got caught in the storm. They're perfect gentlemen. One of them coaches high school football. Another one's a nurse at the VA. They're good people." "Mom, 3 hours ago you were terrified of them." "I was wrong," Eleanor said simply. "I was wrong about who they are and what they represent. They're staying tonight, and I'm making them breakfast in the morning before they head out." After hanging up with Sarah, Eleanor did something that surprised even herself. She asked the men if they'd like to watch television, offering them her living room while she retreated to her bedroom. But Jake declined politely. "Ma'am, you've already done more for us than we had any right to ask. We'll be fine here in the kitchen. You've given us warmth and food and probably saved Danny's life." We won't take over your living room too." But Eleanor found she didn't want to retreat to her bedroom. She wanted to hear more of their stories, to understand how she'd been so wrong for so long about people she'd never actually known. She made more coffee and settled into Robert's old chair while the four men told stories about their military service, their rides, their families, their hopes for the future. Danny recovered fully from his hypothermia by midnight, his color returning and his mental clarity restored after warm fluids and gradual rewarming. Eleanor found herself remarkably comfortable in the company of these four men she'd been terrified of just hours earlier. They laughed easily with each other, teased gently, and showed a camaraderie that reminded her of how Robert had been with his hunting buddies, men who'd known each other for decades and could communicate entire conversations with glances. Around 1 a.m., when the conversation turned to their military service, Eleanor asked a question she'd been wondering about. "Do you have trouble with what you saw over there? I've read about PTSD, but I don't really understand it." The men exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that spoke of shared experience. Tommy, the football coach, answered first. "It's different for everyone. For me, it's loud noises, fireworks, car backfires, anything that sounds like an explosion. My brain goes right back to Fallujah in 2006, and suddenly I'm 23 again, watching my vehicle get hit by an IED, Marcus added his experience. I can't handle crowds, too many people, too much stimulation. My nervous system thinks I'm in danger even when I'm just at the grocery store. I've had panic attacks in the produce section because there were too many people, and I couldn't track all the exits." Jake spoke last, his voice quiet. "I lost my wife 3 years ago to cancer. Watching her die was harder than anything I experienced in combat. The PTSD from Iraq, I could manage that with therapy and medication, but losing Sarah, that broke something in me that I'm still trying to fix. The club, these guys, they're what keeps me functional." Eleanor listened to these admissions with growing understanding of how much pain these men carried beneath their tough exteriors. They weren't the dangerous criminals her parents had warned about. They were wounded people trying to heal each other through brotherhood and shared experience. "Robert, my husband, he was in Vietnam," Eleanor said quietly. "He never talked about it, not once in 48 years of marriage. But he'd wake up screaming sometimes, and I'd find him sitting on the porch at 3 a.m., just staring at nothing. I didn't understand then. I wish I'd known how to help him." "Vietnam vets had it worse than us in a lot of ways," Jake said. "They came home to people spitting on them, calling them baby killers. At least when we came back from Iraq and Afghanistan, people thanked us for our service even if they didn't agree with the wars. Your husband probably kept it bottled up because he didn't feel like anyone wanted to hear about it." The conversation continued through the early morning hours, the blizzard still raging outside while inside something unexpected was happening. Eleanor was developing genuine affection for these men, seeing them not as the stereotype she'd feared, but as individuals with complex lives and deep pain and remarkable capacity for caring about each other. Around 3 a.m., she insisted they try to get some rest. She gave them blankets and pillows, offered them the couch and guest room. Jake refused the guest room initially, saying the floor would be fine, but Eleanor was firm. "You're guests in my home and you'll sleep in proper beds. I won't have you telling people I made veterans sleep on the floor." She retreated to her own room but found she couldn't sleep. Her mind kept returning to the evening's events, processing how quickly and completely her beliefs had been challenged. She'd spent 73 years believing something that turned out to be fundamentally wrong. How many other beliefs did she hold that were equally unfounded? The next morning, Eleanor woke at 5 a.m. as usual and found Jake already up, making coffee in her kitchen. He apologized for the presumption, but Eleanor waved it off. "You made it better than I usually do. What are you doing up so early?" "Old habits. Army wakes you up early, and after 20 years, it's hard to sleep past 5, even when you're not in anymore." They sat together in the pre-dawn darkness, drinking coffee and watching snow continue to fall outside. The blizzard had diminished to steady snowfall, no longer life-threatening but still preventing travel. "Ma'am, can I ask you something personal?" Jake said after a while. "You spent the night in my house. I think we're past formality. Call me Eleanor. And yes, ask. Last night you said you were wrong about us, about bikers. That took courage to admit. A lot of people, they dig in and hold on to their beliefs, even when faced with evidence that contradicted them. What made you willing to change your mind?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I think it was seeing the gap between what I'd been taught and what I was actually experiencing. My parents taught me that people like you were dangerous, but you weren't dangerous. You were polite and respectful and clearly cared about each other. At some point, I had to decide whether to believe my lifetime of conditioning or the evidence in front of me. I chose the evidence." "That's rare," Jake said. "Most people can't do that." "Well, I'm a retired school teacher. I spent 40 years teaching children to question their assumptions and examine evidence. It would be pretty hypocritical if I couldn't do the same." Jake smiled at that. "You know, you remind me of my wife. Sarah was a teacher too. 3rd grade. She had that same quality of making you want to be better than you were." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "I taught 3rd grade. 42 years. They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer before the other men began waking. Eleanor made a breakfast that would have fed 8 people, eggs and bacon and pancakes and toast, refusing to let the men leave without proper food in them. While they ate, the conversation turned to practical matters. The roads were still impassable, and weather reports showed the snow continuing through mid-morning. "We don't want to impose on you any longer than necessary," Jake said, "but I don't think we can safely ride until this afternoon at earliest." "You'll stay until it's safe," Eleanor said firmly. "I didn't let you in just to have you die in a ditch 2 miles down the road. Besides, I'm enjoying the company." The truth of that statement surprised her. She'd lived alone for 6 years and had grown accustomed to solitude. But having these men in her house, hearing their laughter and stories, made her realize how much she'd been missing human connection beyond her weekly phone calls with Sarah. Around 10 a.m., Sarah called to check on her mother. "Mom, the news is saying the roads won't be cleared until tomorrow. Are those bikers still there?" "Yes, and they're staying until it's safe to travel." "Sarah, I need to tell you something. I was wrong. About bikers, about tattoos, about all the things I was taught to fear. These are good men who've served their country and who take care of each other. I've been a prejudiced old woman, and I'm ashamed it took this long to recognize it." There was a pause before Sarah responded. "Mom, I'm proud of you. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong. I want you to know that when Tommy mentions wanting a motorcycle again, I won't object. I was wrong about that too." After hanging up, Eleanor found herself thinking about all the other assumptions she'd held without questioning. She'd been uncomfortable around people with tattoos, suspicious of young men who wore hoodies, nervous around anyone who looked different from the community she'd known in rural Montana. How much had she missed by letting fear guide her interactions? The day passed with surprising ease. The men helped Eleanor with small tasks around the house, fixing a loose cabinet door, replacing a burned-out light bulb she couldn't reach, clearing snow from her walkway. They didn't ask permission, just saw things that needed doing and did them. When Eleanor protested that they were guests and shouldn't be working, Marcus laughed. "Mom, you saved our lives. Fixing a cabinet is the least we can do." In the afternoon, when the snow finally stopped and road crews began clearing the highway, Jake approached Eleanor with an unexpected request. "Eleanor, the club does a Christmas dinner every year for veterans who don't have family to spend the holiday with. It's in Great Falls on Christmas Eve. Would you consider joining us? We'd love to have you, and I think you might enjoy meeting some of the other vets and their families." Eleanor's first instinct was to decline. Great Falls was a 3-hour drive, and spending Christmas Eve with a motorcycle club felt far outside her comfort zone. But then she remembered the lesson of the past 24 hours, about letting evidence override assumptions. "I'd be honored," she said, "but I'm bringing food. What do you need?" By 3 p.m., the roads were clear enough for safe travel. The men gathered their now dry gear and prepared to leave. Eleanor found herself unexpectedly emotional about their departure. In one night, these strangers had become people she cared about, and saying goodbye felt more difficult than she'd anticipated. Jake hugged her at the door, a gesture that would have terrified her 24 hours earlier, but now felt natural and welcome. "Just thank you, Eleanor. You didn't just save our lives. You reminded me that good people still exist in the world. Sarah would have liked you. Robert would have liked all of you," Eleanor replied. "I wish I'd known how to connect him with other veterans when he was alive. Maybe he wouldn't have suffered alone." The other men hugged her as well, each expressing gratitude that seemed deeper than just thanks for shelter. Danny, fully recovered, told her she'd literally saved his life. Marcus thanked her for being willing to change her mind. Tommy promised to send her game footage from his football team's championship game. After they left, Eleanor stood in her doorway watching their bikes disappear down the snow-covered highway. Her house felt empty, in a way it hadn't before their arrival, and she realized that loneliness she'd grown accustomed to was something she no longer wanted to accept. She called Sarah that evening with a request that surprised her daughter. "I want you to help me find a volunteer opportunity in Helena. Something working with veterans, maybe at the VA hospital. I've spent too much of my life isolated, and I want to do something meaningful with whatever time I have left." "Mom, what brought this on?" "I learned something important these past 24 hours. I learned that I've been letting fear keep me from knowing people who could have enriched my life. I don't want to waste any more time being afraid of things I don't understand." Over the following 2 weeks, Eleanor thought frequently about the men who'd sheltered in her home. She found herself noticing motorcycles on the highway with different eyes, wondering about the riders, stories instead of assuming the worst. She noticed her own reactions to people who looked different from her, catching herself when old prejudices tried to surface. She also took action on her desire to volunteer. Sarah helped her contact the VA hospital in Helena, and Eleanor signed up to help in their recreation therapy program, leading book discussion groups for veterans dealing with PTSD and adjustment issues. The volunteer coordinator, a woman named Patricia, explained that many veterans responded well to structured activities that didn't feel like formal therapy. Reading and discussing books gives them a way to process difficult topics indirectly, Patricia explained. And having a civilian volunteer rather than medical staff makes it feel less clinical. Eleanor's first session was awkward. She was nervous. The veterans were skeptical of the elderly woman who'd shown up to lead their group, and the conversation was stilted. But by her third session, she'd found her rhythm. She chose books carefully, often veterans' memoirs or historical fiction about war, and facilitated discussions that let the men open up about their experiences through the lens of the stories. One veteran, a young man named Chris, who'd served in Afghanistan, approached her after a session. "Ma'am, thank you for doing this. A lot of civilians don't want to hear about what we went through. They thank us for our service, but they don't actually want to know what that service involved. You're different. You actually listen." "I'm learning," Eleanor told him honestly. "My husband was Vietnam vet who never talked about his experiences. I wish I'd known how to help him. Maybe by helping you and the others, I'm making up for not being there for him the way I should have been." Christmas Eve arrived, and Eleanor drove to Great Falls with her car loaded with food she'd prepared for the veterans' dinner. She'd made her famous cinnamon rolls, a green bean casserole, dinner rolls, and an apple pie. The address Jake had given her led to a community center that had been decorated with lights and a large banner reading Iron Warriors MC Annual Veterans Christmas Dinner. The community center was filled with people when Eleanor arrived. At least 80 veterans and their families gathered for the Iron Warriors annual Christmas dinner. The space had been transformed with decorations, long tables set up with plates and silverware, and an enormous buffet area where food was already being arranged. Eleanor felt a moment of nervousness walking in alone, but Jake spotted her immediately and came over with a huge smile. "Eleanor, you made it! Come on, let me introduce you to everyone." For the next hour, Eleanor met more veterans than she could count. Vietnam vets in their 70s, Gulf War vets in their 50s, Iraq and Afghanistan vets in their 20s and 30s, men and women who'd served in every branch, who'd seen combat in jungles and deserts and mountains, and their families, spouses and children and parents who'd supported them through deployments and homecomings and the difficult adjustments that followed. What struck Eleanor most was the warmth and acceptance. These people, who had every reason to be suspicious of an elderly woman who'd admitted to decades of prejudice against bikers, welcomed her without reservation. They thanked her for helping Jake's group during the blizzard, asked about her volunteer work at the VA hospital, and treated her like honored family rather than an outsider. Danny, fully recovered from his hypothermia, introduced her to his wife Maria and their 2 teenage daughters. "This is the woman who saved my life," he told them. "If she hadn't opened her door that night, I'd have died from exposure within an hour." Maria hugged Eleanor tightly. "Thank you for bringing him home to us. We're so grateful." Marcus introduced her to his 3 college-age kids, explaining that Eleanor reminded him of their grandmother who'd passed away the previous year. Tommy showed her photos of his football team's championship game on his phone, pointing out plays and explaining strategies with the enthusiasm of someone who loved his work. The dinner itself was remarkable. The food was plentiful and excellent, a mix of traditional Christmas dishes and contributions from families representing various cultural backgrounds. Eleanor's cinnamon rolls disappeared within minutes, with multiple people asking for her recipe. She found herself sitting between a Vietnam veteran named Bill and an Afghanistan veteran named Ashley, both of whom had fascinating stories about their service and their lives afterward. Bill had been a helicopter pilot in Vietnam, had been shot down twice, and had spent 40 years afterward working as a commercial pilot before retiring. "And I didn't talk about Vietnam for 30 years, he told Eleanor. "Came home in 1971, and people treated us like we were criminals, so I just buried it and tried to move on. But it doesn't work that way. The trauma doesn't disappear just because you ignore it." "What changed?" Eleanor asked. "Eleanor?" "I met these guys." Bill gestured to the Iron Warriors members scattered around the room. "Started riding with them about 10 years ago. First time in my life I was around other vets who understood what I'd been through. We didn't have to explain ourselves to each other, and that made all the difference." Ashley, who'd been an army medic in Afghanistan, had a different but equally powerful story. She'd treated casualties under fire, had saved lives and lost friends, and had come home with severe PTSD that made civilian medical work impossible. "I couldn't handle the emergency room. Too much chaos, too many reminders, but the club helped me find a different path. Now I teach first aid to other vets, helping them get EMT certifications. It's still medical work, but in an environment where I feel safe." Listening to these stories, Eleanor realized that the Iron Warriors MC was more than just a motorcycle club. It was a support network, a chosen family, a lifeline for people who'd experienced things most civilians couldn't comprehend. These people took care of each other in ways that went far beyond riding motorcycles together. After dinner, Jake stood to address the room. Before we move on to gifts and dessert, I want to share a story about why this club matters. 3 weeks ago, 4 of us got caught in a blizzard between Great Falls and Helena. We were in real trouble. Danny was going hypothermic, and we didn't think we'd make it. Then we found Eleanor Crawford's farmhouse. Eleanor felt dozens of eyes turned toward her as Jake continued. Eleanor could have turned us away. She could have called the police and let them handle it. Instead, she opened her door to 4 strangers who probably looked pretty scary, let us into her home, and saved Danny's life. But here's the remarkable part. Eleanor told us that she'd been taught her whole life to be afraid of people like us. She'd been raised to believe that bikers were dangerous, and despite that lifetime of conditioning, she chose compassion over fear. That's courage worth celebrating. The room erupted in applause, and Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. She hadn't expected public recognition, hadn't wanted it, but the genuine appreciation in the room was overwhelming. Eleanor's been volunteering at the VA hospital in Helena since our visit, Jake continued. A running book discussion groups for vets dealing with PTSD. Several guys here have been in her groups, and they've told me how much it's helped them. She's become part of our extended family, and we're honored to have her here tonight. After Jake sat down, several veterans approached Eleanor to thank her for her volunteer work. One young man named Kevin told her that her book discussion group was the only thing that had gotten him through November, a particularly difficult month for him due to anniversaries of losses in combat. "You created a space where I could talk about things I couldn't discuss anywhere else," Kevin said. "The books gave us permission to be honest about the hard stuff. That matters more than you know." The evening continued with a gift exchange, Secret Santa, among the club members and their families. Eleanor was surprised when Marcus approached her with a wrapped package. "We didn't forget you. This is from all of us." Inside was a leather jacket, custom-made with patches identifying her as an honorary member of the Iron Warriors MC. The back featured a patch reading Honorary Iron Warrior and her name. Eleanor held it up, overwhelmed. "You're one of us now," Marcus said. "That's not just a gift. It's a lifetime membership in this family." Eleanor wore the jacket for the rest of the evening, feeling simultaneously ridiculous and deeply honored. A 73-year-old woman in a motorcycle club jacket should have felt absurd, but instead it felt right. She'd found a community she didn't know she'd been missing. The drive back to her farmhouse that night gave Eleanor time to reflect on how dramatically her life had changed in 3 weeks. That blizzard night when 4 bikers knocked on her door, she'd been forced to choose between fear and compassion. Choosing compassion had opened her life to people and experiences she never would have discovered otherwise. Over the following months, Eleanor's involvement with the Iron Warriors and the veteran community deepened. She attended monthly club meetings as an honorary member, not riding, but participating in planning for charity events and community service. She expanded her volunteer work at the VA hospital, adding one-on-one mentoring to her book discussion groups. In February 2019, she helped organize a suicide prevention workshop at the hospital, using connections through the Iron Warriors to bring in speakers who'd survived their own suicide attempts. The workshop reached 40 veterans, and 3 of them later told Eleanor that attending had saved their lives. "I was planning to kill myself the next week," one veteran told her privately. "I had everything ready." But hearing those speakers, hearing that other people had felt the same way and come through it, made me realize I could ask for help instead. Eleanor's daughter Sarah visited in March and was amazed by the transformation in her mother. "Mom, you seem younger somehow, more engaged with life. I wasted 70 years being afraid of people I didn't know," Eleanor replied. "I'm not wasting whatever time I have left. There's too much work to do and too many people who need help." In April, the Iron Warriors organized a fundraising ride for the VA hospital's mental health programs. a 200-mile route through Montana with riders from multiple clubs participating. Eleanor drove support vehicle, carrying water and snacks and first aid supplies. The ride raised $35,000, enough to fund a new group therapy program. By the ride's end, Eleanor had met bikers from 6 different clubs, all of them veterans, all of them dedicated to supporting their brothers and sisters who'd served. The diversity of the community surprised her, men and women, all races, all ages, all united by military service and love of riding. One Vietnam veteran named Frank approached her at the end of the ride. "Ma'am, Jake told me about your husband, about how he was Vietnam vet who never talked about his service. I was the same way for 40 years, never told my wife about what I saw, what I did. It nearly destroyed our marriage." "What changed for you?" Eleanor asked. "I finally went to therapy at the VA. Found a counselor who understood combat trauma, and I connected with other Vietnam vets through the motorcycle community. Being able to talk about it with people who'd been there, that made all the difference. I wish your husband could have had that." "So do I," Eleanor said. "But maybe by helping veterans now, I'm honoring his memory in a way I couldn't when he was alive." In June, Eleanor was invited to speak at a community event about overcoming prejudice and building bridges between civilians and veterans. She told the story of that blizzard night, about her fear when she opened the door, about the choice she'd made to help despite her conditioning. "I was taught that people who looked a certain way were dangerous," she told the audience of over 200 people. "I believed it for 73 years, without ever questioning whether it was true. It took a blizzard and 4 stranded bikers to show me that I'd been wrong my entire life." The lesson isn't just about bikers or veterans. It's about any group we're taught to fear without knowing. How many connections are we missing because we let prejudice guide our interactions? The speech was recorded and shared online, eventually being viewed over 100,000 times. Eleanor received messages from people around the country sharing their own stories of overcoming prejudice, of choosing compassion over fear, of discovering that the people they'd been taught to avoid were exactly the people they needed to know. One message came from a woman in Texas who'd been estranged from her son after he'd joined a motorcycle club. "Your story helped me understand that I was judging him based on stereotypes rather than reality. I reached out to him, met his club brothers, and realized they're good people doing good work. We've reconciled, and I have my son back. Thank you." By the 1-year anniversary of the blizzard in December 2019, Eleanor had become a fixture in Montana's veteran community. She was known at the VA hospital, welcomed at multiple motorcycle clubs, and frequently invited to speak about veteran issues and overcoming prejudice. The Iron Warriors held their annual Christmas dinner again, and Eleanor was there with her traditional contributions of cinnamon rolls and pie. But this year, her daughter Sarah and her 3 grandchildren came with her, wanting to be part of this community their mother and grandmother had discovered. Jake gave a toast before dinner. "It would do 1 year ago tonight. We were preparing for a blizzard ride that nearly killed us. Eleanor saved our lives that night. But what we didn't understand at the time was that she was going to keep saving lives through her volunteer work, her advocacy, her willingness to share her story. She's made a difference for dozens of veterans. Eleanor, you're proof that it's never too late to change, to grow, to become who you were meant to be." Eleanor stood to respond, looking around the room at the faces that had become so familiar over the past year. "A year ago, I would have been terrified to be in a room full of bikers. Now you're my family. You've taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing compassion despite fear. You've shown me that the most dangerous prejudice is the one we never examine. And you've reminded me that there's meaningful work to be done at any age if we're willing to step outside our comfort zones. Thank you for giving me a second chance at life when I thought I was just waiting to die." Eleanor continued her work for 3 more years, until her death in December 2022 at age 77. She passed peacefully in her sleep, and her funeral was attended by over 400 people, including members of 7 different motorcycle clubs, dozens of veterans from her book discussion groups, and staff from the VA hospital where she'd volunteered. Jake Morrison gave the eulogy, his voice breaking with emotion. Eleanor taught us that transformation is possible at any age. She spent 73 years believing one thing, then had the courage to change her mind when evidence contradicted her assumptions. She turned the last 4 years of her life into a legacy of service that will continue long after she's gone. The veterans she helped, the prejudices she challenged, the bridges she built, that's how we'll remember her. The Iron Warriors established the Eleanor Crawford Memorial Scholarship in her name, providing funding for veterans pursuing education in social work, counseling, and other fields serving the veteran community. The first scholarship was awarded to Kevin, the young veteran who told Eleanor that her book discussion group had saved his life. Sarah donated her mother's leather Iron Warriors jacket to the club, where it was framed and hung in their clubhouse with a plaque reading, Honorary Iron Warrior Eleanor Crawford, 1945 to 2022. She opened her door to strangers and opened her heart to truth. May we all have her courage. The story of Eleanor Crawford and the Blizzard Night became part of Iron Warriors lore, told to new members as an example of how civilians and veterans could bridge their differences through mutual respect and willingness to challenge assumptions. Her book discussion groups at the VA hospital continued under new volunteer leadership, carrying on her legacy of creating spaces where veterans could process trauma through literature and shared experience. In the years following Eleanor's death, dozens of veterans would credit her with helping them through their darkest moments. Some had been in her discussion groups, others had heard her speak at events. Still others had simply been inspired by her story to seek help when they needed it, to challenge their own prejudices, to choose compassion over fear. The farmhouse, where 4 bikers had found shelter in a blizzard, was sold after Eleanor's death. But the new owners were told the story and chose to honor it by making their home available to stranded travelers during severe weather. A small plaque by the door read, "In memory of Eleanor Crawford, who chose compassion over fear. May we all do the same." And on Montana Highway 287, where Jake Morrison's group had struggled through whiteout conditions thinking they might die, bikers who knew the story would sometimes pause at Eleanor's old driveway and say a quiet thank you to the woman who'd saved 4 lives and changed countless others simply by being willing to open her door and her heart to people she'd been taught to fear. The lesson of Eleanor Crawford's transformation lived on in the veteran community and beyond. That prejudice is a choice, that compassion is courage, and that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be if you're willing to examine the beliefs you've inherited and choose truth over conditioning.